Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm really thrilled to have with me today Natalie Nixon. Natalie is the author of The Creativity Leap. She's the president at Figure 8, and she's a creativity strategist who helps organizations around the world improve their creativity performance and get the most out of their people. Natalie, it's wonderful having you here today.
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be here.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So Natalie, for people who don't know about you and your work, could you just give us a really brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
Yes, sure. Well, I have an incredibly loopy background. My background is really rooted in cultural anthropology and fashion. And then I folded in design thinking into that during my years as a professor. The last 6 years of my academic career, I created and launched a strategic design MBA program, which was an executive MBA degree that integrated design thinking to help people learn about strategy and leadership and branding and financial operations. And I'm in a really magical moment in my career where all of those very loopy threads of anthropology and fashion and as an academic researcher and design thinking have really converged to help me advise leaders on transformation. And that's really the crux of my work as a global speaker, as an advisor to executive leadership teams, is to really help them transform. And I do that through the lens of creativity and foresight.
Okay. Now, I've also seen you're a very well-respected keynote speaker around the world. I've watched a couple of your speeches and your TED Talks, and one topic which comes up is if you take it all the way back when you were quite young, a sort of interesting, an interesting way that you got introduced to this idea of creativity without you necessarily being aware of it at the time. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, so I grew up in Philadelphia, and I share a lot about how my father was a big jazz head, and my mother, as his counterpoint and counterpart, was very steeped in European classical music. So my mother actually studied and trained to be an opera singer as a teenager. Did not end up going that route, but fun fact, years later, when she turned 50, she up and learned to play the cello, and she's now 82 and she still plays. But my father really learned to play the upright acoustic bass in the service in the military. He entered the Air Force right out of high school as a young man. And so I grew up in a home full of music. So the Blue Note catalog, jazz catalog, was a big part of my soundscape as a child, as was the Frank Sinatra catalog, because as my dad would always remind us, uh, he would say, "That's Count Basie backing up Frank, girls. That's Count Basie." And so I just grew up hearing the names of jazz icons. And for most of us who grew up in a house of jazz music, jazz is not for little people. It's a very sophisticated and complex music form. So it was really a way that I leaned into connection with my father. I didn't really understand all that I was hearing. The ballads, of course, were a lot more accessible to me. And it wasn't until I was a teenager that I really began to try to understand jazz music. I also grew up studying dance. So I studied dance, modern technique, since age 4. And that expanded again in my high school years. I danced in the company in college, and I continued to dance. Did a little bit of performing in New York City in my early 20s. And I still am a dancer. I consider myself a lifelong dancer. If anyone follows me on Instagram, then they'll see that I share quite a bit of my dancing escapades. And right now, I'm a student of hip hop and ballroom. So what was a lot of was very gratifying to me when I was earning my PhD while working full time as a professor, that the the intellectual theoretical framework and hook for my research reconnected me back to jazz because I was looking at the ways that the Ritz-Carlton Hotel designs experiences to delight its guests. And it turns out that the Ritz-Carlton Hotel is a very improvisational organization. And I used a heuristic that Frank Barrett thought up from jazz music to understand the ways that they design services for guests. So it was just really cool how full circle my personal experiences and perspectives have been and how that's informed my professional career.
Absolutely. I mean, anyone who knows about jazz appreciates there's a lot of practice that goes into it to develop the skills, but at some level, you reach this ability to improvise. And you just talked about something like an improvisational organization. What is that?
An improvisational organization is one that allows for what I call fluid structures. So, contrary to what some people may think, improv is not doing whatever you feel like. Improv requires rules, and you have to know the rules and either to stretch them, expand them, rebound against them. And so, what an improvisational organization is not, it's not an organization where there's a lot of micromanagement, where there's a permission slip culture. It's not an organization where it's free for all, where there's no rules, but it is an organization that has some clear guardrails and guidelines, usually driven by the people who they're serving, right? Who are we? At the end of the day, we're in this business because we're trying to sell experiences, services, products to these people. And in the world of design thinking, we would think of them as design principles. How do we want to design the work that we do? Those are the boundaries, those are the guardrails. But it allows for, in all complex systems, it's self-organizing, it's adaptive, and it's emergent. So if you think about those three descriptors, if you strive to design an organization where people can adapt, where leadership can be emergent, where it's not just top down, and where there's a bit of self-organizing, which means that it's not a permission slip culture, where people can see an opportunity and are given the agency to run with it and build it out, and be have a much more experimental approach to it.
I keep coming back to this metaphor of jazz because I think I'm a bit similar to you when I first started being exposed to jazz as a young teenager. Um, and I actually even played in a jazz band at school, but
Nice.
I was never really at the proficiency to be able to improvise there. So I liked being in the band. I didn't like the practice to get into the band. But if you see groups that really can jam together, um, when people think of improvisation, sometimes they might have the false assumption that people are just playing whatever they want whenever it comes to them. But there is this structure and this interplay about knowing when is your turn to come and play your solo or to step back and let someone else into the foreground. Is that related to this emergent behavior that you're talking about in a company, and what might that look like in a team that's not playing instruments?
Yes, absolutely. So I referenced the work of Frank Barrett. Um, I'm forgetting the name now of his most recent book, but I highly recommend his work. And he has seven principles that I borrowed from to understand what we can take from the way jazz musicians work and create and transfer those principles to work organizations. So for example, one of those principles is this idea of solo support. And I always go back to the example of the great jazz drummer Art Blakey, who was the leader of his different times it was quartet, quintet, and as the drummer, he was always in the background. And it's actually the bass that really is the support in jazz compositions. Is the bass that really is keeping the tempo. The drummer actually can go in and out of the interplay, but he was very confident about his place to be in the background, to recede to the back, allow others to shine. He certainly did his shining when it was his turn to solo. If anyone wants to hear some incredible drumming, please check out any recording composition by Art Blakey. He was, a real leader during the cool period of jazz in the late 50s. Um, so what that looks like in organizations is when a leader has the confidence to recede to the back. And so what that might look like, for example, let's think about how we might redesign meetings. So does it always have to be the same tenured person at the front of the room? Maybe you invite a younger person, less seasoned, to design an agenda, think and lead the meeting. Maybe it's a newer person to the organization, might have great experience, but is newer to your culture or culture, who leads the meeting. And that's an example of how you transfer some of the principles that Frank Barrett talks about, and how an organization can work and be designed more like the ways jazz musicians work together and support each other.
Now, we've talked about jazz. I see for the people watching the video, you've got a copy of your book in the background, The Creativity Leap. That's what a
Yeah.
lot of people probably know you from as well. What is the central tenet of the creativity leap, and why is creativity so important in companies nowadays?
The central tenet of the creativity leap is that creativity is not a luxury. It is not a nice to have. It is a must have. And especially during these unprecedented times of uncertainty and ambiguity. This term VUCA environments of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. These days during the COVID pandemic are chock full of those feelings and those realities. And I wrote the book prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. It actually launched in the summer of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. And as it turns out, while I was very nervous about, oh gosh, I remember saying to my husband in March, April of 2020, knowing that the book was scheduled to come out in June of 2020, hey, maybe I should ask the publisher if we can move the launch of the book to September 2020 when things will have quieted down. Then I thought, you know what, let me just trust the process. That's when the book is meant to come out. I'm just going to flow with it. And I did. And as it turns out, creativity is something that people are really drawn to during these times of kind of existential crises for organizations, existential crises for individuals. And the book I really think of as a provocation. It's an offering to help people think about creativity in a much more accessible and simpler way. Because what I found in my research is that, number one, people don't really understand what creativity is. They think it's something that only artists or designers do. So I will hear constantly things like, oh, I'm not a creative because I can't fill in the blank, sing, paint, draw, dance, act, sculpt, etc., right? It just so happens that artists are exceptional at wrestling with the ambiguity of process. They don't run away from that discomfort. They engage in process. They're not only solutions oriented. In fact, they are open to multiple possible future scenarios about how their work might play out. So what I landed on was a definition of creativity as follows: that creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and produce novel value. Full stop. And if we think about the ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, then we quickly realize that creativity is not the domain of only artists and designers who are very good at doing that toggling, but the best engineers, the best accountants, lawyers, teachers, farmers, plumbers, as I like to say, are incredibly creative when they're toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Even artists can be subpar when they're not doing the work of toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And so our organizations, our companies, when they're trying to figure out hybrid work, when they're trying to figure out how much should they be allowing the personal lives of their employees and their teams be seeping into the work. Let's face it, this is a time of hyper blurred boundaries, right? Blurred boundaries between work and home, learning and home, play and work, play and learning, play and home. Rather than fight that, let's accept that for what it is and figure out how we can leverage those blurred boundaries. So the book is full of anecdotes, techniques, tips that are a product of over 50 interviews I did with people from technology, interviewed folks at NASA, people in the perfume industry, beekeepers, bakers, scientists, engineers, a whole range of people to see the ways that toggling between wonder and rigor shows up in their work.
Now, I think the challenge that a lot of people experience day to day is probably no one is going to disagree with what you just said. It is important to foster this sense of creativity in companies, and yet something keeps getting in the way. Somehow the companies admit that it's important, but aren't really willing to go through the change in order to enable that. What do you think are the actual issues that the companies are struggling with, and what actually needs to change in order to make this a reality?
You have to cede control if you are truly interested in letting creativity thrive. You also have to really understand that you're never going to innovate unless you start with creativity, because creativity is actually the engine for innovation. I define an innovation as an invention converted into scalable value, financial value, cultural value, social value. That conversion factor that gets us from an invention to an innovation is creativity. That's the intermediary. So until we begin hiring for creativity, incentivizing for creativity, so it's not enough to say, okay, guys, I want you to be more creative. Okay, well, you have to incentivize it with budget, time, additional people talent if necessary, right? So that it's not just a nice to have, it's not just an add-on on top of the work, but it becomes core and integrated to the work. The reason I said a lot of this requires ceding control because another part of the wonder rigor ecosystem is how I think about it is I offer developed a framework. I'm a framework nerd. I developed a framework called the 3 I's because I thought, well, it's not enough to tell people, okay, toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, off you go, you're creative. Now, how do you do that consistently? Well, it's by implementing the 3 I's, which are inquiry, improvisation, which we've already talked about, and intuition. And that inquiry piece is so important. There's a chapter in my book, The Creativity Leap, where it's called Ask a Better Friggin' Question, right? Questions are inputs into a system. If you keep asking the same questions, you're going to keep getting the same answers or outputs. So, how do you start thinking of better questions? One step towards that is associating with people who have different training than you, a different background from you. Hire people into teams, invite people into teams and problem solving that have very different perspectives because they'll look at the same challenge and they'll come at it from a very different place. They'll from a very different question. And all of a sudden, that opens up a new way of approaching the challenge, whether it's a marketing strategy, a new financial model, envisioning the future state of your organization. So the 3 I's of inquiry, improv, and intuition are very important in making that shift of really embedding creativity into the way your organization is designed.
Just to yes and your point about inquiry, I'm going back through a lot of the research around creativity, and one thing that struck me as I was reading again today is apparently the most successful creatives are not the ones who jump straight into the problem solving phase, who try and develop solutions. Apparently the most successful creatives are the ones who spend a disproportionate amount of time finding problems. And I think this comes back to your questioning stage, where you need to change the way that you approach the process of coming up to the solution. Because a lot of people think about creativity as the moment when you come up with the ideas. That's near the end stage, but it involves so much more than that. It involves, to get to the end value, a better understanding of what value actually would mean and for who, and what might we go about thinking of that in a different way.
I got just to build, yes, and build on that. I love that because, yes, that really points out the amount of inquiry, deep observation, really spending time in that wonder. I don't know about you, but I find that when I write, in most of my creative processes, the Pareto rule applies, that 80-20 rule applies, where there's so much is just just marination, marination, marination. I'm just taking a lot in. I'm pondering. I'm putting stuff up on a wall. I'm walking away. I'm going back to it, and then whoosh, things converge, and I begin to write it out. And that's an example of trusting the process, right? So there's so much that happens in these implicit, tacit, invisible domains of creative work that is very frustrating for the contemporary design of corporations, because we want to keep track of what's measurable, obvious, visible, evident, when in fact, the reality is there's quite a bit that happens when you're in the domain of wonder, when you're allowing yourself to purposefully get lost, wander, just take things in, observe. And then the synthesizing work begins to happen and the output happens. And so that's a very different way of thinking about work output.
So we've talked about improvisation, we've talked about inquiry. Talk to me a little bit about intuition, because what does that actually mean? Is it about just going with your gut? Is it about getting the work done? What does that actually mean?
Intuition is something that I define as pattern recognition. So, and sometimes I call intuition brain feelings. So it's intuition is that nudge that I should work with her and not him, even though her resume isn't as sniffy and the pedigree isn't as impressive. It's it's a type of data, but we don't always acknowledge it as such. Uh, that when I interviewed all of these different leaders, and I remember specifically, I got to the point where I was interviewing the CEO of a tech firm who has a PhD, he's a PhD engineer. And I thought, oh gosh, when I start asking him about intuition, he's gonna just scoff at me, look at me like I have three heads. But I started engaging in the conversation and asking about what he thinks about intuition, how does he use it, and he got totally engaged and shared with me how he makes his best decisions when he's factoring in his intuition. Now, as an engineer, he also likes to incorporate that with quantitative data and data that we think of in traditional terms. But I was really interested to see how he really embraced his intuition. Since writing the book, I've done a lot more research of my own about the physiology of intuition. And some of the listeners may be aware that in our bodies, we have something called the vagus nerve, VAGUS. It's the second longest nerve in our bodies. The first longest nerve is the spinal cord, and the vagus nerve extends from our cranium down through our heart into our gut. And so when we say things out loud like, my gut is telling me, yeah, we actually have this internal antenna that's hardwired to transfer information. Also, more recently, I started learning about the salient network in our brain, which actually is a physiological way of understanding what, in my terms, I've been calling toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. So it's super interesting to me how we are increasingly embracing and identifying the scientific research that shows the value of intuition, how it's not something we should bury. Intuition is a kind of muscle or sonar, and the more we use it, the stronger and clearer it gets, and the more we ignore it, the flabbier and dimmer it gets. So it's very important to apply our intuition.
Absolutely. And the moment you start talking about scientific research, my ears perk up. Natalie, I've really enjoyed our discussion. If people want to find out more about you and your work, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. People can learn more about my work at figure8thinking.com. That's the word figure, Figure, the number 8thinking.com, where they can learn about my speaking, my advisory work, and my writing. And please follow me on Instagram at NatWNixon, and definitely connect with me on LinkedIn.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get all of those links down in the description below. Natalie, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thank you so much, Nick. This was a joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.